Hey everybody, David R. Becker here with BeckerArt, and today's tip and actually lesson will be how to soften edges and how to blend watercolor. And it's one of the easiest things to do in watercolor because you don't actually do it. The watercolor does it for you. So let me just show you. I'm going to be using a Stonehenge Aqua cold press pad of 140. This is a cold press, and we also are going to use a hot press. Same thing, 140. And both of these we'll be able to blend, and it's going to be harder to blend on hot press because hot press is a smooth surface. Cold press is a rough surface. And so let's just start on the rough surface and show you that this paper is rough, but I'm going to show you how to blend watercolor when you're putting down a wash and you want to blend, let's say, make a gradation. Let's say, for instance, we want to make a gradation from light to dark. And we want to keep this, that maybe this is a sky that's really blended. Everything's really super blended. So let's do like a sky. And so we're just going to go in here. And I've noticed that a lot of times students are looking to see how there's lines in there. Well, if you leave it alone and if there's enough water, it will blend itself. It will basically sit down and just kind of get really smooth. Yes, you do have to do a little bit of manipulating with a little bit of the water, because if the water puddles up a little bit more, then you have to make sure that it's evenly distributed on the paper. But you can see here, now I don't want to put more paint on, or more water on my brush. I want to just keep taking pure pigment. If I do put a little water on, I'm going to blend it down onto my towel. And I'm going to go back up here, and let's say we want to put a little bit darker up there on the top, and we want to blend it. Okay, let me just show you again that you do not do the blending. You kind of put it in there, and if the water is wet enough, and of course water is always wet, it's going to blend itself. It basically takes and blends itself, watercolor. That's the most wonderful thing about watercolor. Yes, you can go over it a couple times with your brush to kind of help it out, but when it comes down to it, you're going to let the water blend the paint. And also it gives you soft edges, right? So a lot of times you'll have lines in there like this, but if you go in there just when you do the last stroke, just let it sit and let it blend. I mean, there's other ways of getting blended areas in watercolor, like airbrush, but you know, that's a whole tool to give you a really, really smooth. I mean, that's really smooth when you use an airbrush. But here you can get, like I said, again, you don't have to have blending it. You let the water, and the water blends the pigment for you. So this is a really good example of trying to learn how to use enough pigment so that the pigment is not so thick that it can't blend, and it's not so thin that it's just running all over the place. It's just a little bit of exercise in learning how to use enough paint. And you can almost feel it when you have it down there. You look at it and see how when I look here, what I'm doing is I'm rubbing, yes, I'm rubbing back and forth, but I'm not gonna, see how soft I got up there? Because you just kind of leave it at a certain point and let the watercolor blend itself. And let's say we wanted to put some kind of soft edges in there. Let's say a cloud that is soft edged. You can do that by just adding more pigment. Let's do a dark cloud for one. And it will, you know, the more pigment, the more it's not gonna bleed, and it's gonna blend itself soft into the background. If you just let it soften itself. You do not, again, have to soften the edge. People tend to think they have to soften the edge, but you don't have to, because you're working wet into wet for one reason. That's why you work wet into wet, is when you want to get a soft edge. But blending, people like to blend soft edges, and you don't have to blend soft edges. Again, it's done on its own. See this edge? There's an edge here, and that's going to blend all on its own. And I'm just going across this a little bit, but you see how these are lines when you're going across it, but they go away because it's just distributing in the water. And so this edge is nice and clean, and look at how soft everything is. And then again, that's the reason you want to wet everything, is just let the water do its own thing. It will blend it automatically. You do not have to blend it. Matter of fact, if the more you try to blend it, the worse it's going to get. So look to let the water blend itself. So let's try it on a hot press. This is cold press, so it's absorbing in, but there's a little texture in there. Now with hot press, nothing absorbs, and it's like there's no tooth to it. So what happens is a lot of times when I'm wetting it, and also watch when I'm wetting with a color, I'm going to wet it, and everything sits on top so it doesn't soak in. So the softer the paper and the more pigment that soaks in, the smoother it's going to get by chance because it's going into the paper and smoothing itself out. But on hot press, it's staying on the top. So you really have to watch out that there's enough water, and you blend it a little bit, but it ends up being a lot smoother looking. See how there's lines in there, but as it dries, those lines go away depending on how much water you have on there and how much pigment you have. So it's just enough pigment so that you can let it float. And then, yes, there's the lines. When I first put the brushstroke on, there's a line, but it just slowly goes away. Why does it slowly go away? Because the water is just distributing the pigment into those areas. And yes, this is, see how, when you first put the wash down? And the thing is, on hot press, you kind of do this and get out right away. Just put it down and get out, because look at how it's blending itself smoother and smoother as you go along. If I want to smooth something out, or let's say this little bit of white right there, you see, and I see people looking at that, stuff like that, and trying to go over that, but you're going to totally wreck it. Why? Because you're moving that pigment around. You're maybe putting too much water in, taking water out, because your brush has to be exactly the same wetness as the paper. Otherwise, you're going to screw everything up. Just let the pigment and the water, let the water blend the pigment and make it soft. And look at how soft this got now, and look at how smooth that is. And it's going to get smoother and smoother as it dries because it's just absorbing. And then it'll get to where it's going to get a little bit lighter. But there are going to be spots that are a little bit lighter than darker, and that you try to do with different kind of pigments, granulate differently. So you just have to figure out and just experiment with different kinds of things. Now it's damp, and people I see trying to soften things. So let's say I try to go back in here. Let me show you how disastrous this is. Because when you go back in and you try to smooth things out, you're going to make more lines, because this is, and actually it's going to be okay if I tend to be able to work. So this is what you guys would do. You use too much water, you put more water in there. And if there's too much water, it's going to bubble up in certain spots and it's going to blend. And so you look at how, if you try to blend it, like to go over it a lot, like you would with oils and acrylics, you try to blend by going like this, going over and blending it. Well, you don't have to do that with watercolor. I'd rather you just go over, see how you're getting all these marks and stuff because you're trying to blend it. No, instead, just give yourself long brush strokes and just try to let the pigment bleed into the water and let the water soak itself together and distribute the pigment. And this is going to be really smooth. You just watch how smooth it's going to get. And again, blending like something darker in there. Let's go with a really dark blue. Let's make, again, blue clouds or whatever. You don't have to blend those clouds in there or get them soft edged, because they automatically become soft edged because it's wet. This is so important, and I've been explaining and teaching this a lot, because I noticed that students who are oil painters or acrylic painters before, they just want to blend. They just feel like they need to blend it and make a soft edge. And you really don't ever have to blend a soft edge in watercolor. It does it on its own. It's putting water down and letting the pigment just settle down and spread out and distribute it into the water. And that's why why I call it floating your pigment, because you're basically floating your pigment into the water. I mean, look at how smooth this is now. You're basically smooth as ever, because you put that water down and let the pigment just smooth itself out. You do not have to soften it. Now, that said, yes, you can smooth out an edge if you want. Like, let's say I put an edge here, and then these are hard edges because they're on dry paper. So these hard edges are hard because they're dry, right? Well, you can't see that. So that's a hard edge, right? It's on dry paper. But let's say I want to now go in there with a brush and I want to soften that edge to the white. Then I would just take a brush and take water and then just soften it like that. But what I'm doing is I'm basically taking the water and distributing it farther ahead so that the pigment will float into that area. Hopefully, that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to give it enough pigment. And this is the hard part, because doing it afterwards, then you got to re-wet everything so that everything is the same wetness. You're always trying to make everything the same wetness so that it is floating. And then now this edge that was hard before is soft because I wet it with clear water beyond that, and it just softens itself. I didn't have to rub it back and forth. I just let it bleed into that water. All right, so from this point on, please let the pigment do its thing. Let it just go and blend itself. You do not have to blend it. It's the best thing about watercolor. You gotta love it. I mean, it's just all the other mediums, oils, pastels, acrylics, you have to blend to get a soft, smooth edge. Watercolor, it's instantaneous. It's automatic. It's just learning how to wet the paper and letting it soften itself. All right, so this Thursday we do a paint along. Every Thursday I do a paint along. And we're going to have some soft edges hopefully in there. And we're going to see if we can get some smooth edges in there too. So join me then on Thursday at 6:30 Central Standard Time. And if you want to know anything about what I'm doing, just go to my website at BeckerArt.net or my name, DavidRBecker.com. But don't forget the R. It's at DavidRBecker.com. All right, and so until next tip, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.